Well, since it's 100 degrees, I thought we would do this outside. Besides, the view's nice. You can see all the fires when they show up. So this is the introduction to week 5. At this point, we're exactly halfway through the semester. Yes, it goes very quickly. And I'd like to remind everyone this is a good time to check your grades. If you're missing assignments, you should turn them in as soon as possible. Oh, but in the syllabus, it said we can't turn in late assignments. Yeah, that's basically a way to prevent people from turning in assignments late and getting into that bad habit. But if you do have outstanding work, now would be a good time to turn it in. It certainly does affect your grade significantly. And if you're receiving anything less than an A in this class, it's because you're missing assignments. There's no other reason for that. So this week we begin part 1 of 2 of Epistemology. And a lot of this material you will already be sort of familiar with because, well, it's two sides of the same coin. It sort of shares that coin with metaphysics. So with metaphysics, the questions are things like what exists, why does it exist, things like that. With epistemology, we come to the questions of knowledge, or how do we know that these things exist. Like I said, a lot of the readings are the same authors. You may see some overlap, and quite honestly, if you went back and read some of the previous selections again, after you read these selections, you would start to see different facets of those texts themselves. So epistemology is divided into 2 sections, and I'll explain why. I apologize, I live right by a highway if it's loud. The first week, this week, we're going to look at rationalism and empiricism. They're 2 different schools of thought. Most philosophers fall into one category or the other. Now, that's not to say they're exclusive. Generally, it's not the case that any one philosopher is purely an empiricist or purely a rationalist. But we teach it this way because it's easier to highlight the distinctions between the 2 schools. Then next week, we're going to come in and we're going to read Kant. And Kant is the modern philosopher par excellence. He's probably the most read philosopher since Aristotle. He's late 18th century. And a lot of his ideas have influenced how we do science these days, even though, of course, it's pretty old. So, like I said, we'll be looking at empiricism and rationalism this week. And there's a couple of problems that are generated. We'll start with the rationalists. And the question that the rationalists are going to pose is something like, they are at odds with the empiricists because, unlike the empiricists, they believe that there are forms of knowledge that do not come from experience. So what does that mean? Well, that's sort of part of the investigation. In the discussion, there'll be some mention of innate ideas or ideas that are inborn. They come with us when we were born into the world. What are those? They're not things like instincts or reactions. They're actually capacities or faculties for knowing certain things. In the texts, they may give examples like, for example, God is an innate idea, but that's really not that interesting. The example I would suggest, and it's a more modern example, is has to do with the way we acquire language. So if you have a child, or you've raised a child, or you are familiar with how children grow up for whatever reason, the way a child learns language is one of those interesting, kind of fascinating things that it's not unexplainable, but it is unexplainable without the concept of innate ideas. Well, how do we know that? Think of like a computer. If you want to teach a computer to learn a language, you have to program, first of all the syntax, how the language functions. The computer has to, understand what the words are and how they interact, but it still doesn't naturally acquire language. There's all this background information or something that's required in order for it to process it correctly, and it still doesn't do a very good job. Whereas if you have a 2-year-old, 1 week their vocabulary is 500 words, the next week it's 600 words, and they parrot what adults are doing. They do it very effectively. They learn language in a way that's almost, we would say, natural, because they have some sort of innate faculty to acquire language. This is something we can explore further, and you're certainly interested. If you're interested in that, there's plenty of resources to look into that. But when I think of an innate idea, that's what I'm thinking of. Something that doesn't come from experience. If it came from experience, then a computer would learn language just as quickly as we do, and that's absolutely not the case. There's a text written in the 1970s called What Computers Cannot Do, and then they revised it a few years ago and it's called What Computers Still Cannot Do. And the acquisition of language is one of those particularly human things that we do, and it has to do with what we would call innate ideas. So in the text, when you're reading that, you can keep that sort of in mind as a background. That's not the example that we traditionally teach in philosophy classes, but we don't need to get into that here. So the first philosopher you're going to read is John Locke. He's pretty straightforward. His political works actually form the basis of our Constitution, but again, that's chapter 9, and we're not going to read that. That's a side note. He will get into a debate with Leibniz about innate ideas, and that's something that you should focus on. The other important aspect of this week's reading is David Hume. Hume is a pure empiricist, which means for Hume, everything that we know comes from experience. There's not one aspect of our knowledge that's not something we've seen or heard or felt or tasted or touched or something like that. That's an untenable position. I know a lot of students are naturally empiricists, or they're sort of geared in that direction, and that has to do with the sort of STEM background that many of us come from, which is fine. But if you're a pure empiricist, there are certain problems that will arise, and Hume addresses these. We identify 2 in this class. There's the problem of induction. Induction does not have a ground. It does not have a way. You cannot found inductive reasoning without some form of, we call them a priori ideas. You cannot do that if everything comes from experience. And related to that problem is the problem of cause and effect. If all of your knowledge comes from experience, there's no way to say that one effect will necessarily follow another effect. Something really straightforward, like if I drop a brick from my roof, it will fall onto the ground. I mean, that's something that we learn through experience, of course. But the fact that that occurs necessarily, you cannot know that if you only gather that information from experience. So those are both parts of one of the questions at the end of the module. There are only 4 questions this week. They're worth a few more points because I wanted you to think a little bit about this a little bit harder. This is, of course, very rapid. This is normally 2 or 3 weeks worth of work. So I just want you to focus on the concept of innate ideas, how they work and what the debate is about, and the problem of induction and the related problem of cause and effect. And I've updated the chapter to sort of address previous students' issues, so hopefully it's a little clearer. If it's not, that's fine. Now, in terms of reading the text this week, it's actually pretty easy. You have the introductory section, then you have the part about rationalism, then you have the part about empiricism. You're reading 3 philosophers total. With those 3 in the introduction, I would break that up into 4 sections. The most interesting reading, I think, is Descartes. That's what we start with. He's going to talk about how we know anything, what we know with certainty, and the way he does it is by writing, he calls a meditation. He literally went away and locked himself up in a cabin in a cold, dark place and woke up each day and wrote a meditation. And they're a fascinating piece of philosophical history because of the way they're written. It's him with his thoughts, and if you follow along with it and read it like it's a novel or something, you can kind of get into the reasoning that he has in sort of a more natural way. And I would point out that this selection, the first 2 meditations, there are 6 total, we only read 2. The first 2 meditations form the basis for the movie The Matrix, so it's the exact same sort of idea. How do I know that what I'm experiencing is real, and how can I be sure that I actually exist? And there's some interesting questions there. So other than that, I'll check in soon. I hope everyone's having a nice, warm week. It's been a little ridiculous here. Please email me if you have questions about your grade or if you would like your grade to improve. You have 4 more weeks in the semester, and that's not a lot of time, so I would encourage you to act now. Otherwise, have a nice week.